is the Vintage RPG Podcast, your source for the best in classic and contemporary RPGs. With your hosts, Hambone and Stu.
Welcome to the Vintage RPG Podcast, coming at you again from the clubhouse hidden somewhere in the swamps of New Jersey. I'm John Hambone McGuire, and with me, as always, is the editor-in-chief of Unwinnable.com. I once asked him what's best in life, and he said, classic books, new bookshelves, and metal on vinyl. Stu Horvath.
Yep, it's the truth.
I know what you likes.
I love me some new shelves.
How you doing today, Stu?
Pretty good.
So, Stu, what are we talking about today?
In case you hadn't already figured it out, we're talking sort of specifically about the Conan movies, the Schwarzenegger Conan movies. I don't really want to get too much into the Robert E. Howard novels or any of the larger Conan intellectual property. We're just going to focus in on Arnie.
Yeah, because if we really dip back into everything that is Conan, we'd have to do a series of episodes.
Yeah, and we probably will. I just don't want to do it right now.
Hey, that works for me. So the Conan movies are an old favorite of your pals over at Unwinnable. We used to do movie nights back in the day, and we would not only watch Conan the Barbarian, we'd watch Conan the Barbarian with the director's cut, because if you think that you know Conan, you've got no idea until you hear John Milius talking about the cast.
Oh my God. It's like a train wreck. It really is. You can tell that Milius and Arnold are both in this like small room watching the movie with, recording equipment, smoking cigars. It's like hot and sweaty. You can feel the discomfort, but like Arnold Schwarzenegger, his running commentary of the movie consists of him laughing at like things that he did and just saying exactly over and over and over again. Milius says something and he's exactly like over and over, like I think it's over 130 times over the course of the commentary track. It's amazing.
We once kept a running tally because we thought it would be a great drinking game. And that being said, we do not recommend or condone this, because once you get, 10 minutes in, you're on your way to the hospital with alcohol poisoning. If you do a shot every time he says the words exactly, then you're dead.
Exactly. He laughs so hard in the scene where he punches the camel. He's like, yeah, like that crazy, like almost like a donkey bray laugh that he gets. Like, it's so worth watching the commentary, even if John Milius seems like a complete creep.
Oh, he is a complete creep every day and twice on Sunday. And he just lets that creep flag fly so high in this commentary.
Yeah, as much as you'll be entertained by Arnold Schwarzenegger's possibly drunk, possibly stoned commentary, like whenever Milius talks about Sandal Bergman, like it's just gross.
It's so gross. But let's talk about something that's not gross. Let's actually talk about the movie itself.
Oh, God, the movie is so good. And I feel like people have come to think of Conan the Barbarian in some ways as a punchline, just because it was the most successful and highest profile of a larger trend of barbarian movies in the late 70s and early 80s. And almost all of those barbarian movies are terrible. Like the second runner-up is Beastmaster, which I love.
I fucking love Beastmaster.
It's a long epic movie by the director of Phantasm, of all people. And it's camp goodness. And for audiences in the 80s, when, there wasn't a lot of fantasy material being filmed, you just glommed onto that. And you ignored all of like the rippling muscles and the lack of clothing and all the stuff that sort of gets made fun of. And the idea that barbarian movies are sort of like a family safe version of a gay stag film, and like the big buff sweaty men punching each other.
And none were more buff than Arnold in the 80s.
It's true. And all of this is sort of true of Conan the Barbarian, the 1982 movie. But at the same time, it's also a really great movie. Like, you can't escape the barbarian camp aspects of the movie. Like, they're there, and like you just kind of have to accept them and look past them. And if you do, there's like this really fantastic fantasy movie that's like one of the best fantasy movies I think ever put to film. And I don't think it's appreciated as such. Arnold himself just has like this huge outsized camp factor to begin with, coming in from the bodybuilding thing and like his subsequent film career. And like he's sort of just an outsized camp figure to begin with. So I think that there's all these sort of filters that prevent a lot of people from just seeing and appreciating how awesome these movies really are. James Earl Jones is the villain, and he's fantastic. He's insidious. His cult is like a hippie cult, which is like a left turn. Like you expect the serpent priest to have like this crazy death cult, but he doesn't. He's got like a love and harmony cult, which is a death cult, but it has these trappings of like the flower power movement. I think that's super interesting. And the special effects are great. He turns into a snake at one point, and the orgy scene, which is like so good. The soundtrack, my God, the soundtrack by Basil Poledouris is huge. And I listen to it all the time. I was so happy when I finally got it on vinyl, so I could listen to it on vinyl all the time. And it leaves such an indelible mark, I think, in a lot of thematic ways on fantasy. And I love it so much, Hambo.
You are definitely a fan.
Sandal Bergman's character is great too. And you would think that because, it sort of plays on the Frazetta painting trope of like, the big muscular barbarian dude raising the sword high and then the scantily clad large bosomed lady sort of like hanging onto his knee, and like you think that that's what it's going to be. But Valeria is a super strong character who stands her ground against Conan, and I think is the second most memorable character in the movie, certainly the most heroic, and saves Conan's skin more than once. And I think that's just sort of a really interesting thing that gets overlooked because you don't see a lot of female characters at this particular moment in that kind of role. Yeah, she still dies, and it's all sort of like to make him sad. But I still think that for the moment, she's a pretty progressive female character.
Well, it's interesting because earlier in the episode, you had mentioned Beastmaster. So the difference between a Conan the Barbarian and a Beastmaster is about $11 million in budget. So Beastmaster had a budget of $9 million, whereas Dino De Laurentiis had a budget of $20 million to get this movie made. So by and large, the effects, the visual storytelling, the soundtrack, the artwork, everything was working off of a budget that was more than double what something like Beastmaster had. And I mean, with $9 million, that's a lot of ferrets. And I hate to say it, but having a larger budget will always, by and large, buy you a little more timelessness when it comes to making a movie and having it be something that you could watch decades at this point down the line and have it still hold up to a degree. Because when you have the budget to do the things you want to do and not have the effects look cheesy, well, people are still going to want to pay attention to something like that. And you have someone who is, by and large, a camp icon. I mean, yes, Arnold made some of the highest grossing movies of all time, but in the end of the day, everything he does is kind of campy. Look at Predator, look at The Running Man, Commando. I mean, even Kindergarten Cop, in some ways, the Terminator movies, the earlier Terminator movies, they're kind of campy movies, but with a massive budget, which gives them that staying power. Whereas something like a Beastmaster is a camp classic, because there is no way with a $9 million budget they could ever stand up to something like a Conan the Barbarian and hope to be taken seriously.
Yeah.
Especially with ferrets.
Again, with the ferrets. I feel like you hit upon something. I feel like Arnold is sort of camp embodied, and partly because he has become like the incarnation of like the doofy action one-liner.
I'll be back. It is not a tumor. Get to the chopper.
Get to the chopper. Like, I don't think anybody has ever done as large a body of work as him before or since. But Conan doesn't talk much throughout the entire movie. He doesn't talk at all until like 20 minutes in. And the first line he gives is the what is best line.
To crush your enemies, to see them driven before you, to hear the lamentation of the women.
Like, so you wait 20 minutes, this silent protagonist who's had his family killed, his village destroyed, sold into slavery, gets himself thrown into the gladiator pits, and, becomes like this super fighter. And like, he doesn't say a word, and those are his first words. And that's not a camp line. Like, it's funny, but like in the movie, it's like, okay, you take him seriously. If it's campy outside the context of the movie.
Oh, 100%, because in the movie, when he says that, you are like, yeah, I want to be on his team.
Yeah, because he's going to chop everybody else in half.
Yeah, I would prefer to be at the pommel of his sword than the tip.
Yeah. I just think that it's a really perfect moment in time for this one singular fantasy film. Like, there's nothing else out there at that time outside of like Dragon Slayer, I think is maybe the other contemporary ish movie that is as good as Conan the Barbarian. And then like you kind of wait until like the Lord of the Rings movies, and they're not even that great.
You know, I will say by and large, Conan is arguably the best fantasy movie ever put to film. Hands down. It really does stand the test of time. Maybe not Conan the Destroyer. Wildly different animal. But Conan the Barbarian is, and I will say this, and I will draw this line in the sand, and I will tell you, Conan the Barbarian is the finest fantasy movie ever put to film.
And I'm going to support you in that, because when me and my wife recently watched it, my wife doesn't have any kind of, stake in fantasy culture. When we watched Conan the Barbarian and she finished, we finished it. She didn't fall asleep in the middle, which was just like, whoa. And then when when we finished it, she was just like, that was really good. We should watch the next one. And I was like, no. So Conan the Destroyer comes out 2 years later. It is the sequel to Conan the Barbarian. Arnold Schwarzenegger reprises his role. It is not directed by John Milius. It is, I believe, still produced by Dino De Laurentiis. Its budget was only $18 million.
And it shows.
Yeah, it does show. That $2 million was important. Also, Oliver Stone wrote Conan the Barbarian, which blows my mind. He didn't write Conan the Destroyer.
Clearly.
So, I don't know, a year later, my wife and I watched Conan the Destroyer. She totally fell asleep halfway through. Like, just out cold. I had to leave her on the couch when I went to bed. She was just that dialed out of it. However, I really liked it much more than I expected to, but it's definitely on the level of a Beastmaster and not on the level of Conan the Barbarian.
See, I wholeheartedly agree with you. I watched it maybe 6 months ago, actually, because I was looking for something to watch, and I didn't want to fully commit to Conan the Barbarian, so I put on Conan the Destroyer, and it's a great, campy fantasy movie. However, I will say maybe it's the spiritual sequel of Conan the Barbarian, but it should never have been the actual sequel of Conan the Barbarian. So this movie's female hero is Olivia d'Abo from the Wonder Years before she ended up on the Wonder Years. She's no Sandal Bergman. She's like a princess that needs to be rescued. And that's kind of the whole plot of this story.
But there's an interesting thing that I give more credit to the movie than I expected to, because I was watching it and I was just like, oh man, she's just sort of like a little girl who's like obviously infatuated with big muscle bound Arnold. And first of all, I forgot everything that happens after the mirror scene, which is halfway through the movie. There's a whole bunch more movie after that, but I guess I usually stop watching at the mirror scene. So everything after that was sort of a surprise. And I was just like, oh man, he's going to just marry her and they're going to kiss at the end and it's going to be like, oh, everybody's happy. But they don't do it. She becomes queen and gives all of their friends and companions positions of power. And then all that's left is Conan standing before her. And she's like, be my king. And he's like, no, I want to make my own kingdom, build my own throne. And then he comes up and like, you think they're going to kiss? And she kisses him and he totally doesn't kiss her back. I've never seen that in a movie before. And then he leaves.
Yeah, total no sell.
You think it's going one way. And I thought that was really interesting. I don't know about the politics of it or anything, but you feel like they're going to subvert the character and they don't.
Well, the thing too is that, you speak about his traveling companions. This is one of the first really great Dungeons and Dragons movies without actually being branded Dungeons and Dragons, because he does have a full adventuring party of characters of different classes. He's got a rogue, he's got a magician. What would you call Grace Jones?
I would say that she's like a thief acrobat.
Right. So he's got everybody pretty much covered, and he's the barbarian. And like, you don't really see that before, or you couldn't really identify it, I think, before you really understood the concept of like Dungeons and Dragons back at that point in the 80s. And I think it's so cool because there are different aspects of the movie, whereas, Conan the Barbarian was one long tale. Conan the Destroyer feels like you are going through different parts of a module, like different adventures. Like you could actually break the movie up into 3, maybe 4 different scenarios. As if you had Richard Fleischer acting as the dungeon master while he was directing it. You could really break the movie up into portions and have really satisfying encounters as a movie. And I really did appreciate that. I really did love it. Where would that extra $2 million that they didn't get from the original budget gone to? It probably would have gone into making the creatures look a little cooler. They looked cool, but when you watch it now on an HD TV, you're like, oh man, those monsters look bad.
Yeah. And you know, the big monster apparently at the end is Andre the Giant in a rubber suit.
Shut up. Really?
Yeah. I haven't been able to confirm it, but I don't care. If it's wrong, oh well.
I don't want to be right. I want to believe that to the day I die.
Yeah. That's my new headcanon. But you're totally right. If we rang up Richard Fleischer, the director, or somebody who was involved in the production, and Stanley Mann, I think, did the screenplay, if we got in touch with one of those folks and asked them if they were thinking about D&D, I think the answer would be yes. This is the first time you see like a clear kind of Dungeons and Dragons approach to like fantasy character classes. And there's just little things when they're escaping from the cultists, they're trying to get out and there's a bard grate. And Conan does like the bend bars thing. That's like the strength thing.
Yeah, he does.
There's an illustration of it in B1, which is like, you know, a bunch of adventurers by a steel grate that's like a sewer, and the strong guy is bending the bars. I think it's the only actual illustration in early D&D of the bend bars in action. And it's totally the same as the scene in Conan the Destroyer. And I love that. It's so cool. D&D was at the height of its powers in 83 to 85 in terms of penetrating into the public consciousness. I think that there is an intentional lifting of D&D stuff for the movie.
So another cool thing is that as much as we are going to commit to Andre the Giant being in the big monster suit in the end into our headcanons, that would not have been the only notable celebrity appearing in the film. Will Chamberlain appeared in the film.
Will Chamberlain appeared in the film, is a complex character and a badass character. He's got an awesome costume. His spiked mace with the blade on it is like an awesome fantasy weapon. He's great. I was really bummed that he decided to actually turn heel at the end. I was really pulling for him to find his conscience. And Grace Jones is in it, and she's just like pure ferocity. She doesn't have many lines, but she's awesome to watch. She's just a force of nature.
Oh, she really is. She's amazing in this movie.
I feel like Conan the Barbarian is an attempt to make a serious Conan movie, and I think Conan the Destroyer sort of embraces the camp, and it doesn't care so much about the weighty trials and tribulations of Conan. In the first one, he's trying to find his place in the world and make sense of the death of his family and finding his father's sword, revenge, whether or not his god believes in him, stuff like that. Like, it's weighty. And this one, it's just like, you know, Sandal Bergman's character died in the last movie, and like the lady in this movie is just like, well, I could bring her back. And it's like an obvious con. Like, the people he's hanging out with are like, Conan, you know that she's not on the level, right? He's like, no, she is. All right, whatever. You got the big sword.
Yeah. I liken Conan the Barbarian to the dungeon master who does a lot of prep work leading into the game. And I liken Conan the Destroyer to the dungeon master that just lets you do cool stuff.
Yeah. And getting back to the D&D connection, 1984 is also the time that TSR drops their licensed Conan modules, Conan Unchained and Conan Against Darkness. Both of them are terrible. They're totally on rails. They have weird new rules. You play Conan and other characters, and it's just like, well, come on, everybody wants to be Conan.
Yeah.
Like, how are you going to run that game? But it's not inconceivable to think that, like, if they had this licensing deal, that the filmmakers were aware of Dungeons and Dragons. We'll get into Conan Unchained and Conan Against Darkness another time, because there's a lot of Mystery Science Theater style fun we can have with those.
Yeah, they really do warrant their own episode.
But the D&D connection, I think, is pretty clear and likely. So if you want a fun D&D flavored movie, I think you should check out Conan the Destroyer.
All right, Stu, do you have any final thoughts on the Conan movies?
Oh, God, I totally forgot. We talked about Conan the Destroyer, and we didn't talk about Conan the Destroyer, the soundtrack. It's by Basil Poledouris. It works with a lot of the same theming and instrumentation from Conan the Barbarian. I think that most people think that Conan the Barbarian soundtrack is one of Basil Poledouris' like best things ever. And I think that Conan the Destroyer's soundtrack is just as good, if not better. The opening theme is one of the best fantasy pieces. Now, Anvil of Crom from the first movie is like a beast of a track, but the overture for Conan the Destroyer is also so good. There's like all these weird like spaghetti western strands that get woven in that are so good. And you would think, oh, spaghetti western, that doesn't really work with like fantasy, but it does. It totally does. It's so heroic. I love it.
I highly recommend that if you are a dungeon master or a game master and you're looking for some real good background music, definitely look towards Basil Poledouris.
It doesn't get nearly enough love. Everybody talks about Barbarian. Destroyer is just as good.
All right, well, that's another awesome edition of the Vintage RPG Podcast. Stu, where can the people find you?
I'm going to go down to the living room and pop my Conan the Destroyer vinyl on and just listen to that. Is that cool?
That's fine. So you won't know where he is. You could also find him on Instagram at Vintage RPG, where you could find out more cool stuff about Conan the Barbarian.
I feel bad. I didn't mean to make you do the work.
It's fine. I'm a pitch man. You could also find me on Twitter at Handbreaker. I tweet about cute animals. I tweet about Dungeons and Dragons. I tweet about board games. You could also find my day-to-day adventures in podcasting and in life over on Instagram at John Hambone McGuire. If you love the podcast, think about becoming a patron over at patreon.com/vintagerpg. We've got a lot of really cool extra stuff happening over there. If you love the podcast, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe because your reviews do help other listeners to find us. So for Stu Horvath, I'm John Hambone McGuire. May the dice always roll in your favor.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, review, and subscribe to the podcast. Every review helps other listeners to find us. The Vintage RPG Podcast is a ham-fisted production. Music by Dega West. Art by Schaefer Brown. If you like the podcast, you should also consider becoming a patron at patreon.com.